For the past several years, it has been a family tradition for Marge and myself to make the journey south to the Albert Desert and Malheur Refuge for the opening day of trout season. Has been an extremely wet year in southeast Oregon, and the snow geese are in mass on their migration north. We move south and see the high water is up almost to run over the road. Not only is there much snow, but they've had lots of rain down here this year too. So it ought to be a good year if it dries up enough and warms up. The migratory birds are showing up in mass now. The ibis are in by the thousands, and they're just setting leisurely preening in the spring sunshine. The horses are catching a few minutes of relaxation time and enjoying the sunshine before they have to be saddled up to drive the cattle high up into the Steens Mountains to their summer range. They will soon feel the weight of a cowboy straddling them and hear the yipping of the cowboys and the barking of the dogs as they head the cattle to the Steens. The excessive rains and the runoff from the snow in the Steens Mountains have flooded it all around the old round barn. This is on the National Historical Society Register, and it was built in the 1880s by cattle baron Pete French, and it would handle between 1,000 and 2,000 head of horses per year. They broke them in this round barn during the winter, and it included stables for these horses.
Pete French was born in Missouri in 1849. As a young man, French worked for Dr. Glenn, who owned large tracts of land in Sacramento Valley. When Pete French was 23 years old, he took 1,200 head of cattle north to the Blitzen Valley. In 1883, Pete French married Glenn's daughter, Ella. Glenn was murdered 3 weeks later by a former employee.
Pete French continued to expand the cattle empire. He put 500 miles of barbed wire fence to protect around 35,000 head of cattle and 3,000 head of horses.
French was not popular with the new homesteaders in the area because he owned or controlled most of the water in the southern Harney Basin. His fences also made it difficult for some homesteaders to get to and from their property. On the 26th of December, 1897, French was shot dead one frosty morning by a settler who had been unsuccessful in getting a road easement across French's property.
The Pete French Glen Cattle Company expanded over 150,000 acres of the best valley land in the whole area. After French was shot that one fateful frosty morning, no one else could ever get it together to handle the cattle company, and it was divided up into smaller parcels. From the round barn, we head on over to where we're going to spend the night, and then we have an extra day to look around. A few antelope take to hoof and head out across the hill in front of us. We travel past the Krills into the town of French Glen. French Glen was established by Pete French, where a hotel and several other things were built for cattle buyers and cattle traders of the time. The hotel was then replaced in about the 1920s, and it's still open today. You can still spend the night there, and for a rather steep fee, you can even eat at a round table the things that the cowboys would have eaten at that time. Most of the businesses in French Glen have closed, but the old hotel still hangs on and remains. We head east off the paved highway onto a gravel. Our destination for tonight will be Page Springs Park. We're supposed to meet Sam there, but we didn't expect him for another day yet. And to our surprise, we find that Sam came in a day earlier too, so we'll be able to get together as soon as Marge gets one of the little envelopes and registers us into the campground. A few deer are feeding right behind the campground on some of the tender green grass. When they see us coming, they move on out. We arrive and find Sam leaning on his pickup in front of his antique trailer. We back into a campground and set up our camp for the night. The next morning, we're up pretty early, and we're going to spend this day looking around since fishing season won't open for one more day. Across from where we're camping is a goose. They seem to be nesting all over the place. Sam and I climbed to the top of the hill right behind the campground where we're camped, where we can overlook the entire valley. What a view! Sam and I go back a long ways. We were park rangers together at Cape Lookout Park on the Oregon coast many years ago. We go on up the trail and see some little undercut caves and some other very nice rock formations, even a few icicles. We sit in the mouth of the cave and take a break for a second before going on. After we get Marge up, we go on to explore the rest of the Pete French Empire. An old owl sits wisely on top of a tree, thinking we don't even notice. He's so well blended in that he's quite difficult to even spot, sitting on his perch on the tree. Then to the P Ranch, which was headquarters for Pete French's ranch. The old winch is still here that was used to butcher beef. The old haystacker still sits out in an unmowed meadow, and the long barn, which was used for feeding cattle during those long cold winter months. It's built of many juniper trees, and it's about 150 feet long. The center portion of it was used to store hay in, and then the hay could be pitched into both sides of the barn into feeders and stalls. An old hay wagon still sits in here with wooden wheels.
Just like the one we used, except we had steel wheels instead of the wooden wheels.
Oh yeah, we had one on our ranch with the wooden wheels. Here, and you just, they could have.
Most likely did, just so they didn't have to move it so far.
Yeah, but they surely stack some outside because of haystackers out there. Boy, this is a long old barn, huh? The old willow corral. The old winch with the meat hooks on it. And it was just the old winch for butchering beef, and the meat hooks.
It was a rope. See this?
Oh yeah,
You wouldn't have done that with a cable.
yeah, it was a rope, and then they'd tie it there. So maybe they just, one or two men would pull that. And look at here, these are hand forged. Aren't those neat?
With an H.
H.
They would have a towards an
Uh,
eye. Anything on
I don't see anything on it, but that one's,
it? I don't know if it's an H. I think it's an H and not an I.
yeah, that's probably the initial of the guy that made it. See, they put a cedar post on both sides and pile willows in.
Yeah.
Now we're going to take the 8/10 of a mile hike down a gravel road with a gate locked, so we have to walk. And this will take us down to an old sod house, and also there's a hot springs right in front of the house, past the old loading chute. And we're going to head over and take a look at the old sod house. There's some sheds that look like they're built with that same willow construction. A post on each side, and then you pile willows in to make the windbreak. Out here at that time, you just used whatever materials were available, and there were plenty of willows, so why not use them? And some juniper that made really excellent posts. They'll last pert near forever. Beyond the willow kraals is the little house that was built of sod. It was used whatever materials were available. And I don't know the full story on this sod house, but I suspect that it was lived in until they built another house, and then there's some plain lumber in it, so apparently they had done some rebuilding of it. But sod made a really nice house, and then you'd put willows and poles on top and throw dirt on it, and that would be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. The roof is now gone on the old soddy house, and so it won't be here too much longer. That sod just won't stand up without the protection of the roof, and the boards have caved in, and the dirt that was on the roof is deposited right smack in the bottom of the house. We see a lot of shelves in here, so they may have used this for a cellar after they built a newer house. Even birds and rodents have made little holes in the sod, but the grass is still on some of the old sod, which has stood out here for an amazing amount of time. The homesteaders had a need for fruit, and they probably had a big vegetable garden, and there's a variety of fruit trees, some of them still growing and still bearing, although a lot of the trees around have died, And as usual in most all of that part of the country, the eastern Oregon, southeast Oregon, you'll find poplar trees planted around the house. It even looks as though someone's built an archery blind in one of the trees right behind the old sod house. The tree is old and getting rotten, and part of it is breaking off. We look around where the poplar trees are, and we see what looks to be where the site where they built a more modern house, which may have very well burned down. There's an opening in here that looks just like where the house would be, and several trees were planted. It looks as if they must have had children, because there's even a basketball hoop. The old sod house is gradually caving away, and so we're moving on. We're going out and try the little hot springs, which comes bubbling out of the ground within about 150 yards of the house. That must have been pretty nice to be able to take a nice hot bath back in the pioneer days. I found it wasn't that bad an idea to do that right in the modern age of today. That water felt pretty darn good. Out overlooking the big valley, which Pete French had drained most of this swampy valley and made it into some excellent grazing ground. A yellow-bellied marmot sets at attention right by our bridge as we head back toward our campground. He decided to get up on the rail of the bridge where he can be more important and see around a little better. As soon as someone would come by, though, he'd make good his getaway. When they'd go past, he would wait a few minutes and then climb back up on his perch where he can see all around. I don't know why he isn't grazing. He's just kinda lazy today. He has to put on all of his fat right away, because as soon as the vegetation that he feeds on dries up, he'll go into a complete hibernation where he can't even be aroused from it, and he'll sleep all the way till next spring when the green grass starts to show up again. So he better get busy instead of napping on top of the bridge if he wants to survive. A pair of small cottontail rabbits are munching on a few green weeds back in the shelter of a few willow trees. The day is over almost before we notice, and the next morning we're out of bed at 4 in the morning. We're heading to Crumble Reservoir, and we're going to see if we can catch one of those great big red band rainbows that the place is so famous for. So we have to get up there early before the crowds hit. Daylight is already upon us by the time we get our first hook baited and thrown out in the ice-cold water of Crumble Reservoir. It's a little chilly this morning. That eastern Oregon breezes are chilling us to the bone, but we're dressed for it. The sunshine is slowly creeping up over the horizon as we've already cast our lines out into the waters of Crumble Reservoir. There are lots of geese and ducks moving to and fro at first light this morning, and so we listen and watch as we wait and wait and wait for one of these big fish to bite, but they just don't seem to be cooperating this morning. Minutes turn to hours as we wait for that first bite. Marge and I and Sam make small talk as the sun slowly creeps up over the horizon across the reservoir. A white pelican is doing the same thing we're doing. He's doing a little bit of fishing over around the reeds, only he's not that particular what he catches. Hour after hour, we wait and we wait and we wait for that first bite, which never seems to happen. Marge reels her hook in, rebaits, and throws out, and still minutes turn to hours and no fish. About noon, we decided it was time to pull out and head on and do something else. We can eat wieners. We find some petroglyphs from Stone Age man on one of the rocks just beyond the reservoir. It's hard to decide just exactly what Stone Age man had in mind when he made these petroglyphs so terribly long ago, but it looks like he must have been here doing some hunting of maybe waterfowl, because we see bird tracks carved deeply into the sandstone of the rock. And these places were probably a religious place, so we just can't really guess at what Stone Age man meant when he carved these into the rocks so many years ago. An old Canadian goose is standing his ground right along the edge of one of the canals. He probably has a nest real nearby. We gather up our camping gear and take to the road. We're going to head over toward Fields and then on to the Alvert Desert. Sam leads the way, and we're going to stop at Fields and top off our gas tank. Even though it's about $4.35 a gallon, we still need some gasoline. My next stop will be Fields to get some gasoline. Fields was an old stage stop established in 1881. It's still open and you can buy a few things there, get gasoline, and also buy a milkshake or a hamburger. The ruins of the old stage stop is just across the road from Field, within walking distance from the store. Across the road from the store is the ruins of an old stone homestead house. It's built of stone with mud for mortar. It's a little stone house with mud for mortar and poles on the roof. There are even some rough sawed lumbers for the door jambs. And there's some plain lumber. They must have put an attic in it later, which, when the roof went, the attic caved down to the floor. The willows were laid across the poles quite thick, and then mud was put on for the roof. What a nice roof. As we move on from fields toward the Albert Desert, we can see the east slope of the Steens Mountains has a liberal blanket of snow covering it to where about all you see is white when you look up toward the mountain. In about 20 miles, we look out and see the vast expanse of what's supposed to be a dry lake bed called the Albert Desert. But it's anything but a dry lake bed or a desert now. It's totally covered with water, every inch of it. We were figuring on riding the Hondas out and watching some wild horses and exploring, but we can't get any place around with all that water this year. We travel through fields back down south into Nevada, through Denio, Nevada, and we travel to the end of the Pueblo Mountains and then take a right up a gravel road toward what they call the End Oregon Ranch. But there's a hot springs we know of up here, so we're going to go up and see how it is. After just a few miles on a gravel, dusty road, we'll be to the hot springs, and that sounded like the best idea we could come up with. We set up camp, and there's only one way to test a hot springs, and that's get in and try it. We found the water to be just about a perfect temperature, and we can camp right alongside the hot springs where all we have to do is jump in. The steam constantly rose from this hot springs water. It's really a big creek, and you can get in it just about wherever you want. The farther upstream you go, it's closer to the source, and the hotter it gets, the farther up you go. We used the hot springs until the sun dipped down below the horizon, and then we put out lights and even used it after dark. What an awesome place. The next morning we get up and decide to go exploring. Sam unloads his little Honda and fires it up.
And Tom's getting ready to go.
A jackrabbit stands at attention as we buzz by him. We go up to where the hot water comes gurgling out of the ground, and check the temperature.
Too hot, huh? Yeah. Boy, look at it coming bubbling up right out of there. And there's,
All around through the green over there.
yeah, numerous springs. And there's some.
A little monkey flower seems to be enjoying the warmth of the steam around the hot springs. That's the only place we could find anything blooming much. It's just been so terribly cold over there. From the source of the springs, we'll move on our little exploration journey. We've heard about a heavy bomber, a B-24, that crashed out here just at the end of World War II. It was on a training mission, and there's supposed to be some of it on top of a mountain. So we're going to go up and see if we can get an idea where it is. We get up on top of the mountain, and we think we know which peak it's on. We think it's the peak right straight ahead of us, but we're still a plenty long ways from that. We find where a badger has dug a rodent up and had him a nice rodent dinner. Even part of the rodent's nest was left there. After exploring for a couple days, our time is running short, and if we're going to go explore someplace else, we need to do it now. So I'm backing out, and we're going to head over to see if we can find some stones. We've heard about 50 miles from Denio, there's some sunstones and some large agates. So we're going to go check it out. After eating about 50 miles of dust, we get in Sam's pickup and make the final leg of our journey out to where the sunstones are supposed to be. Some jackrabbits hurry to get away from us.
Okay, we're here.
I got the first one.
Oh, you already found one, huh?
Yeah.
We're already seeing sunstone shine.
That one was deeper.
Let's take a look. There's some sunstones on that rock. Yeah. That's nice. There's some no longer in a rock.
Talk to you could sit and talk to him
We
for
found
days.
an abundance of sunstones and some real nice large ones. The sunstones are quite a sought-after stone. They're called the Oregon diamond, and they're Oregon's gemstone. And they can be faceted into a real nice diamond-looking facet, which is quite sought after, and you can find them in a few different colors. They're just a tiny little crystal, although some of them are quite a bit bigger than tiny. We found them one right after another till we found all we could possibly want. This used to be at one time a mining claim, and so we found a concrete plug where they've drilled a hole down through the rock and dirt and then blasted it. A carnivorous beetle makes good his getaway right through the sunstones. He's walking right over them, not even realizing what he's doing. A few tiny little flowers are starting to spread their blossoms out right in the ground, right with sunstones under their petals. Marge has a bag, and so we're going to go see if we can find some of those agates that we've heard about. And find them we did. There are just plenty of agates out here, and large chunks of it.
Look at this guy.
way we were finding agates and sunstone, it certainly didn't take us but very few minutes to find all we could possibly want. So after we get loaded up on our agates and sunstone, it's time to head over to Whitehorse Hot Springs and try some of that nice hot water. There are a few clouds starting to hang on the horizon, and the wind is blowing like it has never blown before. But we've seen wind and clouds before, so all we're after is a good hot bath after our stone hunting in Whitehorse Hot Springs. A few of the world's fastest long-distance runners are sneaking out ahead of us, trying to decide whether they should run or just walk. But when they get to running, there's nothing faster for long distance. There's some of the African animals that are faster in a short burst, but not a long distance like these guys. And the clouds are hanging over the Steens Mountains as we head on out toward Whitehorse or Willow Creek Hot Springs. We go past some old houses from a bygone era of ranching. These were made of stone. Really must have been a nice house. And out behind it, as usual, there is the old stone homestead house, which was built of double-wall stone with mud for mortar and willows and poles for the roof, and then dirt piled high upon it. They're not a bad house. They're warm in the winter and cool in the summer. After looking at the old homestead areas, we move on to where we can see another old homestead house. All along the valleys where there was irrigation, the homesteaders staked out their homestead claims. And this old house was in pretty good shape just a few years ago, but the roof on it has now collapsed. It must have been a little newer one. It looked like it had cement for mortar. On into Whitehorse Hot Springs, we rattle up a fairly bumpy road. We found a really nice spot to camp that even has a picnic table. We camp in an area where there's a cliff behind us and the stream with beaver ponds right out in front. So we have all sorts of wildlife around, which is very nice. And then it's only about 100 yards to walk up to the hot springs. We hurry and set up our camp with the anticipation of getting up and trying that hot springs real soon. The hot springs, again, is just a perfect temperature and it's nice and clean, so we try it out. That night I left my hat set out on the Honda and it frosted but good on the hat. And the next morning I'm up in the hot springs to warm up. We spent the day exploring and trying the hot springs out. And then that evening we hiked up to watch the sun drop down behind the desert horizon over some beaver ponds on tiny little Willow Creek, which is flooding from all the snow melt and excessive rain, so it's no longer a tiny little lazy creek. It's quite a large stream of water right now. What a place to watch the sunset, perched on the stones above Willow Creek. And Willow Creek had some of the original bloodstock of the Lahontan cutthroat in it. And they're a fish that's evolved to withstand shallow lakes and shallow streams that get really hot and quite alkaline. and so they can stand it where other fish can't. And a few years ago, when the drought was here, they almost lost them. They were on the endangered species list, but they're doing pretty good now. The sun is dropping below the horizon, and there's even a sundog. What a fancy sight. We watched the fantastic show that Mother Nature put on for us for some time, right from the top of the little mountain, right above our camp. We went clear out to the peak, right on top of the pile of rocks, where we could get the very best uninterrupted view of the sunset and the mountains around, all with their liberal coating of snow. The next morning, Sam had to leave, so Marge and I went down along Willow Creek to look at the old homesteads, and we saw where there's been a big long-tailed kitty cat. Matter of fact, you call him a mountain lion, where he's left his tracks in the mud for us to see. But I would like to make a rug out of him, but he's far too sneaky. We see one of the old homestead shacks with a juniper pole across where the door went. I don't know how they fit a door in there. Maybe they just hung a hide or something over it. We wanted to go over and take a look, but Willow Creek is a raging torrent now, and there's no way we can safely get across it. So we'll just have to be like the old cat and walk along the bank. Some of the beaver ponds have washed out due to the high water. Looks like that's going to cost those beavers a lot of extra work. And the old homestead shack is slowly crumbling. But that big cat, he's going to move along here till he finds him a good dinner. Looks like he's had him a chicken dinner right here. As we move on, we can see the view they had from this one old soddy house. The old soddy has since melted away, but the chimney still stands on the bank of Willow Creek. And the homesteaders liked a great view and some water for irrigation and drinking, and everything was quite perfect for them. Right here in this spot, with the view of cliffs and the Steens Mountains standing tall in the background. From the old homestead shack, you can not only see the Steens Mountains very well, and Willow Creek is roaring right in their backyard, but there's a cliff right behind where their house stood, with even a little cave in it. If the old homestead man got to misbehaving and got in trouble in the house, he could always go over and climb up in the cave for the night. And the cliff swallows have built their mud nests all over the cliffs right behind where the homestead house was. There's a stick nest perched high upon the cliffs, and near as I could tell, that was a raven's nest. We saw some ravens around, but when we showed up, they decided to take leave of absence. But this nest has been here for years, and they just keep rebuilding it, as well as the swallows return to the same spot again each year to nest. I think it's a raven's nest because it's on the west slope of the cliff where ravens like the afternoon sun, not the morning sun. Around the edge of the cliff, I see a spot where some trapper has set his traps. They've taken a bird wing and hung it with fish line so it flutters in the breeze to attract the animals. It looked like it must have been a bobcat set. I move on over and take a look in Whitehorse Creek. It's cliffs on both sides and a little bit of nice farmland right down in the bottom. As I head back toward the camp, I see a little herd of mule deer bouncing out through a sea of sagebrush. Our time is running short, so we have to head for home, and there's a little bit of late snow starting to hit on the summit of the Cascades Mountains as we head for home.